Alright, so I saw a lot of movies recently, and it's time to review some of them. Here are your timestamps, let's get right into it. The Disaster Artist is directed by James Franco. It also stars James Franco as Tommy Wiseau. It stars his brother as well as Greg Sestero. And the story is about the two of these characters meeting one another in San Francisco, deciding that they both share a passion for filmmaking, a passion for acting. And they decide to move down to Los Angeles, try it out. They figure out that neither of them are really having much success, and so they decide to make their own movie, which they title The Room. Now, this is a true story based off of the actual movie The Room. I've seen this movie, and I don't normally go out of my way to watch bad movies, but, this movie was coming out, and I decided that I wanted to see Disaster Artist. So I thought, well, I'll see The Room, just so I can try and contextualize some of this. And, oh my god, it's insane. It's one of the most atrocious movies I've ever seen in my life. The level of incompetence throughout the entire movie is absolutely astounding. I am so shocked at how this movie got made. And I was fascinated the entire time at just the level of awfulness for everything in this movie. The writing is terrible, the acting is worse, the direction is completely flat, none of the shots make any sense, everything in this movie is just terrible. It's the worst thing I've ever seen in my life. But it's so bad that it is actually very entertaining to watch. So, there's definitely a story there on how this movie got made. And, I had a good time watching The Room, and I thought that I would have a good time watching The Disaster Artist also. And so I watched it, and the part that I described earlier, where I was describing how the two of these characters met, and then they decided to make their own movie, that's the first act of the movie, and that is brilliant. I think that it's extremely well done. I think that that's where this movie shines, because that's the most, where I feel like I learned the most about these two in that time, and it's very interesting to see these two characters work off one another, and it's really, it shows how great the performances are from Dave Franco, and especially James Franco, who they're not acting like they're brothers riffing off of one another, they're acting like they're just two friends, and so they did a really excellent job, I thought. That is easily the best part of the movie. Also, I mentioned it a little bit, the performances in this movie are very, very good, especially by James and Dave Franco, but even more especially by James Franco, because he really does knock it out of the park. And there is a scene in this movie after the credits where it really shows how he just nailed down this Tommy Wiseau character, who's such a weird guy that I don't understand how this person is a person. It's so bizarre. It's so hard to explain, too. It's just some guy who, I don't know. No one knows how old he is. No one knows where his endless supply of money comes from. No one seems to know where he was born. It's such an interesting mystery to this guy, but he's also just a weird person. After the first act, though, this movie really ground to a halt. I thought that when they were actually producing this movie, when they started to make it and they were filming, and it was all the jokes about how, oh, this is how this scene got made, and this is how this scene got made, the movie really did drag in that part for me. I thought that it was interesting, but it felt as though it turned more into a homage to the actual room, like they were almost paying their respects to it, rather than continuing this really interesting story that they set up in the first act. And so I thought that the movie really slowed down significantly. I was still enjoying it, but just nowhere near as much as I was in the first act. And then the ending to this movie was also very rushed, because, this wasn't supposed to be one of the worst movies of all time. They were trying to make something really good, and so there's a screening at the end of this movie where they show The Room for the very first time, and people are over the top laughing their asses off, and they're enjoying the movie, just not in the way that, Tommy would have wanted them to. And so they decide, instead of adding another 15 minutes or so, like 10-15 minutes, that you could have taken out of the second act, just throwing it right in there in the end, to show how he comes around on this cult classic that he unintentionally made. They instead do it all in this one screening, where within an hour and a half, or however long that movie is, like maybe an hour 40, he is totally accepting that, yeah, I made the worst movie of all time. Now I'm just going to roll with it. That's not how it went. Like, I don't know all the details to it, but if I were Tommy, well, actually, there's no way I can put myself in that guy's shoes. He's a weird guy. But it was way too fast. If there were more time dedicated to that, then I think that this movie would have at least had a better ending. Not saying that would have fixed every problem, but that would have definitely ended it on a better note than it did. Overall, this is a fun movie. I would recommend watching it if you have seen The Room, especially if you've seen The Room. You're going to enjoy this movie a lot more than someone who has not seen The Room. If you want to see James Franco's best performance to date, this is the movie to watch. Yeah, this is a fun time. See it with friends. I think that's when this movie would be the most enjoyable. I don't know if I would want to watch it again. Maybe a couple years down the road when I just kind of forget about it a little bit. Then I would watch it again, just have a good time. But really, it didn't stand out as much as I thought it should have, because this is material that really could have been quite fascinating. And it just wasn't. At least is not as much as it could have been. It was still a good movie. I would give it a 14 out of 20. And yeah, I would recommend seeing this movie if it interests you. If it doesn't, you're not going to like it. That's just sort of how it goes, though. Now moving on to the next movie, and the next movie is Coco. Coco is a movie about a young boy named Miguel. He finds himself in the land of the dead, and he has to work his way back to the land of the living through a Pixar adventure. And the way that I describe the plot, I try to make it sound like we've seen something like this before, which we have. This is a fairly predictable story with a lot of very familiar beats, familiar character types, and there were a couple parts in this movie where I knew exactly what was coming, basically. I could have predicted this movie through and through, and I would have known. But the execution of everything in this movie is just so good that it doesn't matter how predictable it is, because it's such a good time to watch. Just to start, the visuals in this movie are absolutely outstanding. It's such a beautiful movie to look at. The design of the Land of the Dead is absolutely amazing. And the quality of animation in this movie is also just, Pixar is getting better and better with their landscapes and the physical environment that these characters are in. I also enjoyed the character designs in this movie. I thought that the designs of the dead characters were quite creative. To a certain extent. You know, it wasn't mind-blowing or anything, but there were definitely a lot of fun visuals in this movie. And there was some really good comedy that surrounded this as well. There was a lot of good visual comedy, too, which I really appreciated. Because they had a lot of, the skeletons. Because that's what the characters in the Land of the Dead look like. They're skeletons. And there's a lot of sort of clever humor where they'll have a body part that comes off and then it just comes right back, and they're able to manipulate it when it's off, not attached to their body. And that led to some pretty good comedy. And the songs in this movie, they were fine. I didn't find anything particularly special with them, which is sort of, they didn't annoy me, which was, I think, the best part, because normally with the kids' movies like this that have songs in them, they annoy the hell out of me, and I just start to get disinterested in the story because the songs don't seem to contribute. But the songs in this movie were perfectly fine. They didn't detract from anything. They actually made it a little bit of a good time, so I was pretty happy with that. Obviously, there is the main song in this movie, which is called "Remember Me." That's the best one. I actually enjoyed that song. It led to some very heartwarming moments throughout the movie, and it's, the Pixar crying moment, and it really does. It is a bit of a tearjerker scene. It didn't affect me personally, but you know, people in the theater I was in, I just heard people crying left and right. So it is a very heartwarming part of the movie too, which is why I think that it had that reaction with people. I kind of wish that there was not an antagonist in the traditional sense. Like I said earlier, the plot of this movie is fairly predictable, and so you're able to predict who the bad guy is pretty early on, but I think that this could have been a much better story if there wasn't a character who was the antagonist, sort of like an Inside Out, which came out a couple years ago, which is my favorite Pixar movie. There isn't an antagonist in that movie in the traditional sense. The antagonist seems to be time. And I wish that there was something more like that in this movie. I think it would have made it a little bit better. But again, the execution of it was very well done, so I didn't mind that much. That's just something that I wish would have been in there. Overall, I really liked this movie, though. I would recommend that everybody see it. It's a very heartwarming story about family and relationships and remembering those who have died, remembering those who are still with you, following your dreams. There's a lot going on in this movie that really does, it makes it a very sweet movie. Definitely kids are going to enjoy it, which is good because it is a kids movie after all, but a lot of adults are going to enjoy this one as well. I would give Coco a 16 out of 20. There was definitely room for improvement, but again, this is just a very, very good movie, and I would recommend watching it. Alright, the next movie on the list is the Meyerowitz Stories, New and Selected. This is written and directed by Noah Baumbach. And this movie is about a family in New York, and it's just sort of a glimpse into their life at a certain period. The only movie that I would be able to compare this to is Manchester by the Sea, just in the sense that it feels like you're just sort of glimpsing in on this part of this family's life. And the characters and the interactions that they have with one another, it feels so real, and it feels like this movie is showing us a real family. Because the conversations that they have with one another, the way that the dialogue is written, and the way that the actors speak the dialogue is so realistic. They're constantly interrupting each other. There's 3 conversations happening at once, just like, you know, Thanksgiving just happened, and Christmas is about to happen. And if you pay attention, that's what happens at these family gatherings. People just talk over one another, and they're having different conversations across the same table. And that's sort of what happens in this movie quite a bit. And there's people who are trying to get on the same page with one another, and it's just really interesting to watch. And this also, it really helps that there's just a fantastic ensemble cast in this movie. Every single performance is great. You have Adam Sandler, Ben Stiller, the 2 of them play half-brothers. Dustin Hoffman is their father, who's the father to both of them. They had different mothers. And it's just so good. The way that the 2 of them, the 3 of them are able to interact off of one another, and it's just awesome. I really also enjoyed the structure of this movie. It was a little bit unique, because the title is, you know, the story's new and selected. So it takes Danny's story, and then it takes Matthew's story, who is Adam Sandler and Ben Stiller, respectively. And it tells stuff from both of their points of view, and then it tells stuff from their sister's point of view, and then from a daughter's point of view, and from the dad's point of view. And sometimes this could have a little bit of a negative effect on the pacing here and there, but I really enjoyed the way that they tried to go about this. There was also an edit that occurred a few times throughout the movie where a character is sort of cut off in the middle of their sentence, and I thought that it either really worked because it sort of showed that after a certain point your family just sort of stops listening to what you have to say, even if it's right in the middle of your sentence, but sometimes it didn't work because it harshly transitioned into a completely different part of the movie. I think that would be more of a taste thing than anything else, because they definitely tried to make it as good as they could, but it won't work for everyone. Like I said, there were some pacing issues throughout the whole movie. Sometimes it dragged, but there is a lot of really good stuff happening to where this wasn't a huge problem, but it was fairly noticeable when I was watching it. I don't, without spoiling what it is, I don't see the significance of the final scene in this movie. I think that this is most likely because I've only seen it once. If I were to watch this movie again, I think that it would make a little bit more sense. I think I would be able to get what the writer-director was going for. But as of right now, I didn't really understand it. But this is a good movie. I think this is definitely not a movie that everybody's going to enjoy. So, my closest comparison is Manchester by the Sea. If you did not like that movie, you're probably not going to like Meyerowitz stories, even though they are different enough to where that might not be the case. But again, that's just the closest thing I could come up with. I really did enjoy this movie quite a bit. I would give the Meyerowitz stories new and selected a 17 out of 20. I would definitely recommend checking this out, and the best part is this movie's on Netflix. So if you have an hour, I think it's an hour 40 movie, just scroll through Netflix and turn it on. It's that easy. So I would recommend checking this one out if you have the time. The final movie that I saw was The Florida Project, that is directed by Sean Baker, and this is the movie. It follows the story of some kids who they basically live in this motel run by Willem Dafoe, and it just sort of goes through their day-to-day life. Now, these kids have a really hard life because their parents aren't well off. They're very poor. They're living in a motel, and it's outside of a Disney World. So it's so close to this happiest place on earth, and yet they're in this miserable place where people are not good to each other, even though they don't necessarily mean to be. Everybody isn't the best person. What I'll start off with, I guess, is I think that the cinematography in this movie is fantastic. This is a wonderful movie to look at. There are a lot of colors that pop out, and it's just a beautiful movie. Every single frame, you could pause it at any moment and just look at it and go, wow, that's a really great shot. It looks beautiful. And it adds such an interesting contrast to the fact that the subject matter just isn't that easy to watch, because again, these kids are just going through this horrible, horrible time. But they don't even realize it, because this movie captures the innocence of a child so incredibly well. Because, you know, the kids don't know what's going on. They're just trying to have fun. So they're running around town, completely unsupervised, doing all of this these random games that they're trying to come up with to try and distract themselves from the fact that they don't really have it that good. And there's a real heart to this movie. It's a very sad movie to watch in that respect, though, because it's very sad to see these kids not know what's going on. They're just trying to make the best of what they have, but sometimes they don't really know how to. And it leads to some very heartbreaking moments in this movie. But the performances in this movie really are fantastic. Willem Dafoe gives the best performance I've ever seen from him. I think that he's definitely going to get a lot of Oscar buzz for this, because really he is just fantastic. Other great performances are from Brooklyn Prince, who plays the main character in this movie, who's a little girl, and the actress who plays her mom, Bria Vinate, maybe is how you say it. She's also really great. This movie did have some repetitive scenes, even though there was a reason to it, especially the bathroom part. There was a reason to it, so it's not a huge complaint, but since they did, it just felt very, very repetitive is all. This movie went on a little bit too long, I would say. You could have cut some of that repetition out. And even though I understood what the ending of this movie was going for, again, no spoilers, it was executed very poorly, and I didn't enjoy it at all. This movie was on track to be one of the best movies of the year. And then the last minute and a half or so really took that away. It just gutted this movie. At least it gutted the ending. But I'm not going to let that take away from my overall enjoyment of this movie. This movie really is one of the best movies of the year. It would have been far better if the ending wasn't as poorly executed as it was. But I would give The Florida Project a 16 out of 20. This is on track to be 18-19 until that ending, which is a real shame. But this is a good movie. It's heartbreaking, it's sad, but it is a very, very good movie to watch. Maybe not a fun time to watch, but it's a great movie. Those are the movies that I've seen recently. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, please be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.